You are listening to the Examine Life with Bram Levinson. Seane Corn is an internationally acclaimed yoga teacher. She is a public speaker who has been featured in more than 50 print and broadcast media channels, including The Today Show, Yoga Journal, and Mantra Magazine. She is the co-founder of Off the Mat into the World, which is a global humanitarian leadership training program. In addition to all of these incredibly popular instructional DVDs that she's released, she teaches exhaustingly, extensively at workshops, conferences, retreats throughout the States, throughout the world. I'm proud to call her my friend. Seane, welcome to the Examine Life with Bram Levinson.
Thank you so much, Bram. I'm so happy just to have an opportunity to talk to you. Just like makes my heart burst. So,
Well, the feeling
yeah.
is mutual entirely. First off, let me just say that the book that you released a couple of months ago, Revolution of the Soul, Awaken to Love Through Raw Truth, Radical Healing, and Conscious Action. It is everything. It's everything. It is funny as hell. It is spiritually, emotionally, educationally revolutionary, in my opinion. And one of the funniest parts of it, I mean, I hear your voice throughout the book, and I hear through in the anecdotes and the stories that you tell, I totally hear your voice. But one of the funniest things that that really stuck with me was when you were talking about when you were in the yoga class at Integral Yoga, and you said, we're invited to lie down on our back. I'm reading from the book now. We're invited to lie down on our back. I welcome that and would gratefully stay there all day. Instead, he, the teacher, tells us to come to standing and, quote, find Tadasana. I stand limply at the front of my mat, looking around at everyone else who appear to be standing at attention, staring forward, tight and rigid. Feet together, straighten your legs, the teacher commands. Arms to the side, long spine, sturdy like a mountain. He tells us to feel our feet on the ground beneath us. Extend your roots deep into the earth and you will find your strength and refuge there with the mother. End quote. Mother? Whose mother? I do as I'm told, I think. But truthfully, I haven't a clue what I'm doing. I don't feel like a mountain. What the fuck does a mountain even feel like? Everyone in the room looks so serious in their mountain, so I make myself look serious too and stare straight ahead without blinking, because surely mountains don't blink. Okay, listen, I read that and I was like, oh, this is my book. It's so authentically you.
Thank you.
Talk to me about like what that's like to put something that from external external perspective looks like you're putting a piece of your heart out into the world.
Oh, I feel like I cut a vein for this. Like I bled out. I mean, I texted you at certain points.
Mm-hmm.
I think during the process, just kind of freaking out because I really did not know what I was doing. And, you've written books, you understand the process. And I was so clueless, yet I just know my personality. And there was no way I was going to put out a book that didn't really sound like me. But yet I didn't know how to make it sound like me. And that was all like so hard because when I first wrote the book, it's amazing how devoid of personality one gets when they start writing. It's very clinical. It was very direct. It was very researched. And I realized at a point that I was telling everyone how to transform themselves, how to change the world, if you will. But what was missing was heart, that I wasn't embodying it and I certainly wasn't showing it. And then I got really scared because I knew then it was going to require a level of transparency and authenticity in present time. Like I couldn't tell the story from past tense. I actually had to step back into it, but I didn't know how to do it. And I fought and went up against every limiting belief, my skill, my talent, my education, everything, to what I called rabbit holes of creative despair, where I would get right to the edge and be like, I don't know what to do next. I don't know how to get past this challenge. And basically, I applied the principles of yoga. I would breathe and I would pause and I would sit with the discomfort and I would wait and trust And eventually something would shift and a line would come out of me, or something true to who I was would come down on paper, and I would giggle to myself and think like, oh, there it is. Like, I found it. And that lasted for like all of 30 seconds. And I would go back into the rabbit hole of creative despair. But I held on to those moments where something would come through me that I knew that's my sense of humor. That's my voice. That's my truth. But it was not a pretty process. Like,
I know the process. I totally understand what you're saying. For me, that I always people would ask, when's the book coming out? And I didn't have a publisher to answer to, so I would always say, it's coming out when the book is ready. But it's such a process of sort of inspiration. When it hits, I get it down. When it doesn't hit, I leave it. I can't push it.
but Bram, what I don't understand is, why would you elect to do that multiple times? Like, that's the part that confuses me. It's like, now that I know how intense it is, I'm not that anxious to jump back into it again. You've actually sat back, organized your thoughts, and be like, yes, I want to do this again. So,
Well, I've done it twice. I'm not sure I want to do it again.
is that true? Really?
It is
Was
true.
the second time as painful?
The second time, the writing wasn't as painful. It's all of the post stuff for me. It's the editing. It's when you get into the
Oh,
clinical. I can't handle the clinical. For me, it's a process of inspiration, and to be honest, I felt a real intuitive pull to do it. So I trusted the pull. I did the work, and then it was time to get clinical, and I can't handle that.
oh.
The clinical stuff it's such it's brain drain for me.
All of it. Picking the
Hmm.
cover, the copy editing, the regular editing, just what story to pick, figuring out how to connect the chapters. It's like when I first wrote the book, I saw the muscles and the bones, but there was no fascia. There was nothing that connected it. And I didn't have a mentor that said, oh, you need to do ABC. And so, but yet intuitively, just, as someone who's read a lot of books, was like, there needs to be a through line that carries the reader, that makes them invest in the story. And I was like, I just don't know how to do it until I figured it out. And I wrote the book for about 2 years before I actually brought an editor in, an amazing woman, Linda Sparrow, who thankfully is also a yoga scholar. And so she was incredible in that she was able to really challenge some, she was able to help me connect the narratives to the philosophical teachings, to keep it traditional, yet at the same time, bring those teachings up to the 21st century and make it accessible. And not just the traditional teachings, but also psychotherapy, the mind body science, all of that stuff. And she was really instrumental in helping me to understand that there was indeed a way to connect these narratives to the deeper teachings in a way that wasn't chaotic, because that's how it felt at first. It was just like I was just throwing ideas against the wall. And eventually it all came together. And, like, I'm so glad that your experience was positive. And so far, most everyone who's read the book, their experience has been positive, because by the time I released this thing, I was so close to the content. It was so personal. It was so intimate, and the teachings were broadening outside of the traditional yogic realm that I really did not know how people would respond. I knew in my soul, though, that I wrote the book I was called to write. I wrote the book I believed was expected of me in my community, that I was telling the truth. Whether or not people would like it, that was a different story. But I knew I took every risk, did not play it safe, maintained my personality, my voice, my ethics throughout the whole thing. And I could live with that. And if people didn't get it, I would just have said, you know what? I'm ahead of my time. One day, maybe they'll
Mhm.
understand.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. But I think you succeeded in spades. Honestly, I think it's a masterpiece. And I mean, I don't really know what I expected. I don't. I guess maybe didn't have any expectation. I was just looking forward to reading the book that you were releasing. But as I was reading it, I would just put it down and just out loud just say, this is the real deal.
Oh,
It
thank
is.
you. Thank you. I started getting hopeful when I sent it out to a couple of teachers, senior teachers in the community who are scholars, who are philosophers, that aren't personally invested in me, meaning that they're not my teachers, they're not my friends, but they have true reputations, in the communities. And I sent it back to them for their feedback. And the level of support I got from them and the way in which they described back to me what I had done, that was the first time where I thought, oh my God, maybe I pulled this off after all. And that made me feel amazing that they actually seemed to get what, in my mind at least, I had hoped to do. Um, so I feel real. I'm just relieved it's out. Um, I feel I haven't felt this light in years, physically. Uh, I'm also hopeful that everyone is telling me the truth, because for the last 6 months, I would tell my classes publicly that if that only thing I can handle, the feedback I can handle was this: genius, brilliant, Moby Dick, revolution of the soul, on the same line. That I had no emotional capacity to handle anything less than that. So
Right.
if they didn't like it, just don't tell me. So
Right.
actually, I'm not 100% sure that my community is not just feeling bad for me.
Well, I didn't know that, and I wouldn't lie.
This is
So
true.
so there you go.
This is true.
Well, listen, the book is written now.
Yes.
You've just come off touring the book. It was
Mhm.
what, a 30-city tour?
30 cities in 42 days. It was so hard.
That is hardcore. I mean, I know that you're used to traveling, but that's hardcore.
And I have no one to blame but myself. I set up the schedule. I convinced my publisher, everyone, that this was the right way to do it.
Right.
And it was so hard. But I laughed because it was a domino thing, meaning that if one thing logistically went off, there's so many things that would have just kind of crumbled, from renting the car to getting to the event. Of a delay in a plane, forget it. Like, there was no room for error. And I had to laugh because I really felt like God was sitting back and saying, you know what? We're going to throw her this one. She's we're pretty sure she's about to crack here. She can't handle any more disruption. We're just going to make this run smoothly, because everything ran like clockwork. And that's
That's
pretty
incredible.
unheard of.
It
Um,
is, especially with flights.
Oh, yeah. It was just crazy. But it was amazing. I stayed out of yoga schools. I focused on bookstores and churches and event centers, places like that, rather than going back into yoga studios to promote the book. I know my students are going to appreciate what I had to write, but I wanted to try to bring the message of not just transformational change, but social justice and what it looks like to take accountability on a really deep level, and to normalize some of these incredibly challenging conversations, and to apply it all back to yoga and therapy and all that stuff. I wanted to bring it out to a broader, more mainstream audience. And I felt that if I went into yoga studios, I would perhaps intimidate people who want the message, but they might not be ready for the asana.
Right.
And so I kept it to in this other realm, which was really great for me. It was also really scary. It was an interesting experience because, and you understand this too, and anyone who's listening who's a yoga teacher understands that the nature of our work is to be the center of attention. And yet, once you start facilitating sacred experiences, the attention deflects very quickly off of you as an identity or a personality and onto the experience itself. And so I can manage the just being the center of attention for a short amount of time, and then knowing that it's going to move off of me. This book tour was really difficult because there was no escaping being the center of attention, being asked a lot of questions, being really vulnerable and intimate in my delivery. And I had to really recalibrate my nervous system because I didn't realize how uncomfortable that was going to make me, and how unskilled I am at just receiving that kind of attention for as long as I had to. And I think that that's the part that I'm kind of detoxing from. That was very fatiguing because I'm just not used to it. And it's not something I necessarily welcome. I don't think it's a healthy thing to do, as a teacher, to let yourself just take on all the projection and have to sit with it. You've got to be able to process it. And so I was like, oh, okay, I didn't anticipate this. So that was probably the most challenging part of it. But the gifts far outweighed the discomfort. And I'm so grateful for that experience. I'm so grateful for all of it. That's how I'm feeling right now. Like,
Good.
even though the writing process was hell and it was so vulnerable, and I was in therapy every week, and just like you said, like the creative process, then the technical process, and then the marketing of the book, it was nonstop. Now that I'm on the other side, I am overwhelmed with gratitude for my community, my peers, my publisher, publicists, everyone who invested themselves in my experience, and in trying to help me deliver this. I just can't believe how blessed I was and still am,
It's
as a
incredible.
result
It's
of it all.
incredible. It really is. I mean, you've accomplished a huge thing with this. Years ago, I remember when we were together in New York, and I had said to you something like, "Are you proud of yourself with everything that you're accomplishing? Are you proud of yourself?" I want to ask that question again. Are you proud of yourself about with this book, with this release, with everything you've done over the past, with everything you've learned as a result of writing the book and marketing the book?
And
Are you proud of yourself? Yeah.
I am now. Yeah, I am very much now. I mean, for years people were telling me to write a book, and I would entertain them, like, sure, I'll get around to it, at some point. But the thing that people didn't know about me, you may know this about me in our conversations, it's like writing a book pushed me up against some serious limiting beliefs. And that included not feeling smart enough, not being organized enough, educated, not having enough content. It was one of those things that, like, when you're in a class teaching, there's uh, there's wiggle room in terms of uh, what happens when you deliver content. In that, when you're in the zone and you're delivering information, I have heard myself contradict myself. In the beginning of a sentence, I'll say one thing, and at the end of the paragraph, I've just went into a whole other tangent. And I've heard myself do this, but I know, because of the passion or the heart that's behind the words, the student isn't listening, they're feeling. And so there's a lot you can kind of get away with as a teacher, where it's like, you know what, I'm going to let that go. But in a book, you can't. People can literally Google and notice, like, on page 10, you said one thing, and page 100, you said something completely different. And I got really insecure about that. But because of what I also believe is that we're here to, I'm sorry, my dog is barking.
Charlie just wants to be heard.
Totally. But, like, my belief system tells me that we're here to be in service to something way bigger than ourselves. And all of our individual talents are meant to serve the collective, so that we can actually unify and move that needle, towards peace. Charlie. Yeah. You should see the look he just gave me. He's like, huh? What? Charlie, come here. Come here. So I hold on to that belief. So the whole time I've been telling students forever, you've got to go towards that which you most resist. You've got to go towards the limiting beliefs, because they're the very thing that's keeping you from actually being in service to spirit and contributing in the way in which we're all called to contribute, meaning your purpose, your dharma. And so I've been saying this for years and years, and yet resisted writing the book because those limiting beliefs were just sitting on my shoulders so hardcore. And so when I was 48, which is 5 years ago, I started working with some senior women mentors to start to really look at what my role is in the community, what's expected of me as I start to age in the community and become the mentor that I've had, And they all kept saying, you have to write a book. I understand now that they weren't telling me to write the book because, that I needed to publish it. I think they understood that it was going to be in the writing of the book that I was going to confront some very deep truths that needed to be unearthed. And one of the very first things that happened when I opened my computer and started writing is the very first line. It didn't make it into the book, but the very first thing that came through me was, "My name is Cece."
Mm.
And I kind of like gasped a little when that happened because, I mean, as you know, my name is Seane. My birth name is Seane, but it's not what my family calls me. It's not what my childhood friends call me. It's not who I was. I wasn't Seane until I left home, until like I was when I was 17 and moved to New York City and had to start getting like jobs where you had to show identification. That's when my name changed kind of organically to Seane. But I realized, not right away, but shortly after, that if I wrote the book as Seane, I was writing it from an identity. And I'm going to kind of talk about myself in third person a little bit because I don't know how to do it otherwise. But yeah, Seane I have mentorship. I have training. I have 30 some odd years on the mat. I have years of therapy. I have wisdom, a lot of deep healing that I can reflect back to my experiences in a way that's very neutral. So there's an identity that any teacher can put on ourselves where we can explain our feelings, we can explain our life, we can explain the challenges and hardships that exist without actually ever having to reveal them. And when I wrote My Name is Cece, I got really scared because I realized that Cece, she had trauma. She had childhood sexual abuse. She had obsessive compulsive disorder. She had issues with cutting, issues with drugs and alcohol, didn't have that kind of guidance, mentorship, or tools. And that freaked me out because I realized that for me to let go of, for me to step into the mentorship, the leadership that I want to step into, there's a certain death that had to happen, meaning not in a negative way, but a death to that identity, that it was going to require me to pull up a new level of vulnerability and accountability and rawness and not apologize as if Cece was any way separate from Seane. And that scared the living shit out of me because I saw what was about to happen and I didn't know how to get there. So when you ask me, am I proud of myself? Yes, because I had to go back to my childhood. I had to go back to Cece. I had to dismantle my own identity and the attachments that I have to that identity and integrate both the shadow and the light sides of myself. And instead of telling people what transformational change looks like, I had to show them, and I had to do it in a way that was going to invite them into their own vulnerability. And because I didn't know how to get there, I had to fight really hard to find it. And in doing that, I confronted those limiting beliefs. I confronted those the messages inside my head that tell me that I'm not smart enough, I'm not gifted enough, etc. I know that that's not true, but Cece doesn't. And that now I can look back and I have a sense of not, it's not that I have a sense, not necessarily of the accomplishment, even though that's huge. I'm proud because I wanted to talk myself out of it every 5 minutes and gave myself 1,000 reasons why that was appropriate, as we always do, and didn't buy into those voices and instead gave them space. And that feeling, basically the yoga works. And that's what I'm proud of. It's like, I knew it. I motherfucking knew it. This shit works. So
Oh, I love it. I love it.
yeah.
I love it. Well, I like that you're talking about the CC identity versus the Seane identity because I got a bit of that from the chapters because each chapter is presented essentially in two parts, narrative and reflection.
Mm-hmm.
Was that an idea that you had at the get-go that each chapter would be divided that way, or did that come up later on in the editing?
You know, it's funny in that if I went way back to the beginning and thought about the book that I wanted to write and stepped back and thought, okay, what do I do best? And I know I'm a decent storyteller. I know that I enjoy that, but I'm also, I'm a teacher, I teach. So I knew that I had the capacity to do both, but it kind of stayed on the back burner. And I guess what I knew is that I started to tell the story, the narratives as Cece. And it felt, and actually my publisher really at one point didn't want me to put the teachings at all, but that didn't feel right. I'm not one to say, here, look at my story, because my personal story is no more or less interesting than anyone's. But what is interesting is to be able to step back as the woman I am now and be like, holy shit, do you see what was happening there? Like, here I was in this narrative. I don't have any tools. I can't know better. But I can step back at 53 and say, here's the yoga. Here are the philosophies. Here are the angels. This moment's going to lead to this moment, and I have no idea. And that kind of came to me in the process of writing, because I had so many narratives written and then so many teachings written, and thought, there's got to be a way to bring this together. I think this makes the most sense. So I had to be in service to the reader. I needed them to be able to flip it around and see themselves in my story, and to feel hopefulness that there are tools that they can utilize to give them insight and wisdom. And so and with the help of my editor, because she really affirmed that with me. Like I said, my publisher was iffy about it, but my editor came in and was like, oh yes, you got to bring these together. I just didn't quite know how. And that was just an arduous journey of connecting the dots, because as a teacher, I'm very linear. And as a storyteller, I'm not, but as a teacher, there has to be A, B, C, D before I can get to Z. And the book, oh my God, like I had to take things out of order sometimes. Otherwise it didn't make sense, and talk about, or at least refer to something, maybe plant the seed of trauma in chapter 2, knowing it'll show up in chapter 10 in a much more fluid way. But that was very hard for my nervous system to adapt to, because it's not how I teach. Right. But creatively I had to adapt. And my editor was the one who was able to kind of talk me off the edge and help me to figure out how to do that.
Okay.
So that's how that all kind of came together.
Okay. I think it's a really interesting moment in time right now for you to be releasing the book, talking about the things that you're talking about, because it seems like it's such a sensational moment in history right now, a volatile moment in history right now, particularly in the US. I know that nothing co-arises without its opposite co-arising with it, right? Nothing comes up just as a free agent. Tell me what you think are some positives about the times that we're living in. What can people pay attention to that is like a beacon of hope in this moment of transition?
Many things. I mean, first of all, as dark as our world gets, it means simultaneously, like you said, we have more access to tools, to teachers, to sacred philosophies that weren't mainstream 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And people are invested, are interested, are getting curious in a way that seems to keep evolving more and more. That gives me hope. The systems aren't broken. The systems were designed to oppress. But the thing is, if we want to dismantle the systems that exist, we have to recognize that the systems are simply made up of people. You change the people, you change the system. So I see that people who are doing this kind of transformational work, they're changing themselves. And as a result, they're becoming more empowered, more informed, and they're getting engaged because they recognize that our liberation is bound, that we can't be free unless we're all free. And so our service in the world becomes an extension of our own personal growth. One's not separate from the other. That gives me hope. The other thing that I see is that, and again, I can really speak in the US, but I do see it throughout the world. What's happening right now is the shadow is being unearthed in a really horrible and painful way for many people who are marginalized, and meaning racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, things that actually, the bias and the discrimination, it was always there. But in so many ways, it was, if you will, whitewashed, because the the dominant culture, people like myself, white, able-bodied, privileged, with socioeconomic advantage, our privilege gave us space from actually having to look at the deep level of oppression that was really deeply embedded in the fabric of our culture. This administration has unearthed that in a way that's unimaginable. And it's bringing up a lot of trauma, especially for folks on the margins. And it's also making people like myself and other people with privilege wake up and recognize our own complicity, our own participation, the way we've benefited from this oppression. And it gives us an opportunity to now change it, but we can't change it without actually A, normalizing it, and B, taking accountability for our involvement in it. And I see people doing it. I see people actually engaging. I mean, my book, this back half of my book is all about this. I don't know how my book would have been received prior to the Trump administration.
Mm-hmm.
I think now people are looking for tools in a way that they didn't just a few years ago. And people in the mainstream wellness communities, which often are predominantly white and have access to resources. I want those people reading this book and doing the inner work and confronting the systems of oppression that exist within themselves and the way we're enacting it, and then going out into the world and actually changing the behavior that perpetuates it. So I do think right now is a hopeful time if we survive it. Just FYI, it can go any direction.
I love that you're talking
But
about
I'm
this, though. I love that you're. Sorry, I cut you off. Go on.
Mhm. That's okay. It's like, I just know, I don't know what happens if we do engage, quite frankly. I like to believe that that peace would be inevitable. That's what I hold in my heart. But I don't know for sure. But what I do know is that if we do nothing, or if we continue on the path that we're at, civil war is inevitable. More pain, more suffering, more division, more oppression, more death is inevitable. And I want to be on the side of at least trying to create the possibility of peace through the inside out work of both personal as well as collective change. I want to be on
I
that side of
think.
history.
Well, I don't think I'm getting shivers. So, agreed. Agreed. And I think that you're doing that. I think you were doing it before, to be honest, before this administration, before this moment in history started. Well, I mean, I shouldn't say that. I don't really know when it started, but you've been doing it consistently. But
Yeah.
I like that you're talking about privilege, because in the book you talk about David Life talking to you about privilege. And by the way, I've studied with Sharon and David, but two of my teachers, you being one of them, have had direct communication with David and Sharon. So I really see them as my teachers as well now, sort of the same way I would see a second cousin kind of thing. But you had written about David Life talking to you about privilege, telling you that you have it, some don't. So be compassionate, be understanding, be nice.
Yeah.
Um, Firstly, for those who don't fully understand the concept of privilege, because this is a concept that I really want people to be able to wrap their brains around, would it be fair to say that privilege is the unearned advantage that one person may have over another based on what makes them more commonly accepted in our world? What do
Absolutely.
you think about that?
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely the way that you would approach it. And it shows up in different ways at different times. It's like, let's say in a male dominated culture, my privilege shows up because I'm white. So there's that. But then I have perhaps less advantage than men, but perhaps more advantage than maybe a man of color. Like there's intersectionality that exists within those complexities. But because I was born white, able bodied, not a heteronormative, neuronormative, all of those things that within our culture are elevated, I get to skirt through life in a way that I had nothing to do with except simply being born. And
Well, see, that brings me to my next question, though, because in keeping with that notion of privilege, and it's a question that I don't mean to offend you with. You know, I know you, and I know the depths of your knowledge and your experience and your intention and your commitment. And you refer to yourself as
mm-hmm.
marketable in the
Yeah.
book. But do you think that you would have achieved as much as you have if you didn't have the privileges afforded to someone who is
Oh
marketable?
my God. I wouldn't be having this conversation with you if I hadn't
Really?
been, and I was in on that from the very beginning. Like I got that right away, what was happening to me. Um, so two things. One is when David Life called me out on my privilege when I was probably 18 at that time. I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. I didn't identify myself as privileged. You know, I had no money. I had no education. Um, I didn't get it at all. It took me years and years to understand, like you said, the unearned advantages that I just came into the world with. It was a deep, deep yogic teaching that happened before I actually ever like rolled out a yoga mat. And then to backtrack it in terms of my success as a yoga teacher, when I did my first teacher's training, and I told you this is back in 1994, I sucked. I was not a naturally gifted teacher. I had intense anxiety speaking in front of people. It was very hard for me to make eye contact. I got very dizzy, and that's I know now that I was hypersensitive. I'm still hypersensitive, and I pick up a lot of energy and information from people, and I didn't know how to channel that and how to actually like filter it. And that was one of the reasons I would get dizzy when people would look directly at me, like more than 8 people. So becoming a yoga teacher wasn't something that I had to work really hard and develop skills. Well, when I became a yoga teacher, I got right away, like this was 1994. This was before the mainstreaming of yoga really was occurring. It was popular in Los Angeles, it was becoming popular in New York, but not the way that we see it now. And I got my first, I got the cover of, I got the, I was in all three of Brian Kest's videos. Um, the cover of Eric Schiffman's book, and then on the Today Show, on the cover of Yoga Journal magazine, all like within like a year of me taking my first teacher's training. And I remember thinking like, oh, I'm getting opportunities that are not being afforded to other people in my peer group who are more talented than me, have more experience than me. The difference between me and them, especially, remember, go back to the 90s, you know, the difference between me and them is that I was, I didn't look like what you may have thought at that time your typical yogi looked like. I was marketable, blonde, blue eye, thin, strong, um, ethnically neutral. And what I mean by that is even in my whiteness, you couldn't quite place me. You know, not Jewish, not Irish. You can't quite see what it is. So I am my body was safe to market to yoga in a way that my friends weren't, especially friends of color or bigger bodied persons, people in my community. I was in on that right away. I thought, oh God, there's no other reason why I'm getting these opportunities except for the way that I look. And, you know, I struggled with it for maybe 5 minutes because I also realized that there seemed to be a direction that this was going. And I knew I loved yoga, and I knew that I could talk about it and maybe challenge the status quo if I could in time. And that if I didn't do it, they were just going to hire some model who didn't know anything about yoga. And that this seemed to be a part of my particular purpose. And so the reason I am as successful as I am had to do with the privileges that were afforded to me at that time because of my marketability. Now, I'm also never going to diminish my skill and my talent as a teacher, only because to do so would be insulting to it
Be
also it
irresponsible,
also insulting to all
I
the
think.
teachers that invested so much time and energy in making me good, and I can't do that. You know, when I
Mm,
think of Matthias Ratti and Eddie Modestini and Sharon and David and all the people who really took time, I know that I'm a good teacher, and I knew even then, even though I sucked, but I knew that it was in me and I was developing. Um, so what I did do though was to challenge the industry, even at that young age. Um, Airbrushing was my big thing, and photoshopping, uh, because I was unrecognizable to myself. And for the first couple of years, I didn't have any power. Um, I had no influence whatsoever. But the moment I started getting any influence in the community, that became one of my first commitments. Is that no company, I would not sign on with any company if they airbrushed me. Or changed my body, because I could show you some photos where, you know, my boobs are bigger, my neck is longer, my thighs are thinner, my skin is whiter, if that's even possible. I Oh yes, everything that
really?
you can think that they would do to
Wow.
someone, they would do. And I became unrecognizable to myself, and it triggered me. I'd be like, "Oh, I didn't know that my butt was big, my thighs were big, my, you know, whatever it was. I didn't know that. I like those things about myself." Suddenly I'm realizing I don't even fit into that standardized um marketable idealized form of beauty that's being perpetuated. I don't even fit into it. And so it became important to me that in any of my contracts that you can never, up to this day, I can't be photoshopped. If there's a wrinkle in my shirt, that can get airbrushed out. Like, I don't care about that. You cannot change my face. You cannot change my body. And I have a right of every photo that gets put out. Before it can get put out, I have to see it first and approve of it. And this has been something that I've stood for since probably after about 2 years, when I started getting some influence. Um, so, yes, to answer your question, and it's not an offensive question in the least. I think it's an important thing to acknowledge and recognize, because it's caused a lot of pain to folks to see not that much representation existing out in the wellness communities, although I do see it changing. Not quickly enough, but it is changing.
Okay. Okay. Well, talk to me about activism. You are one of the founders of Off the Mat into the World, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to instigating grassroots social change by supporting people in becoming conscious and effective community leaders. So I believe that you can't be truly awake in the world in the way that yoga and Hinduism guide us to be without being an activist, without being able to identify what blocks freedom and happiness for
Yep.
everyone. I've also been told by many people to keep politics out of what I
Yep.
do in my career because it's going to polarize people. It's going to hurt my business. Can you speak to that for our listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I've been told that my entire, most of my career. We started off the mat as a response to our own personal work of just kind of waking up and realizing that if yoga means to come together and make whole, and recognizes that there is no separation between anything, then we have to be in relationship with the light and the shadow. We can't deny the shadow. We have to really, I, for lack of a better phrase, make friends with our guilt, our grief, our fear, our shame, our rage, because it's all those qualities that also teach us compassion and patience and forgiveness. And so there's this understanding of integration. When you look at justice and any form of oppression, it is designed to separate. It's designed to fracture, to alienate, which is the opposite of yoga. So there's no place in my consciousness that understands how then do we not orient ourselves towards these fractures? Otherwise, we're the problem. We're complicit to those very fractures. So whether it's animal rights, environmental justice, social justice, indigenous sovereignty, um, immigration rights, politics, anything that impacts the health, the wellness, the goodwill of any living being, we must move towards so that we can change the policies that exist that enforces this level of oppression. And so I cannot subscribe to the belief that there's no space for yoga or justice or equity in our yoga class. I think that's denial. I think that's privilege at its worst. Um, and at the same time, I think that, like, for example, the arc in my book, for the first couple of chapters, I don't have a relationship with God. I don't have a relationship with my emotions, with trauma, with the mind body connection. It's enough for me just to be in my body. And in that chapter that you were referring to, where I'm in mountain pose, at the end of the class, I puke. Like, it takes me years before my nervous system is able to titrate enough that I begin to have an emotional experience in yoga where the trauma is able to safely release. Then it takes me years before that I get comfortable enough with my own personal trauma where I begin to find a bigger meaning to why things happen as they do and begin to open to God. It then takes me many more years to find how my good intentions doesn't always lead to positive impact, and that my service is just more domination, is just more helping and saviorism. It's so my point is that we have to meet people where they're at while simultaneously planting seeds to prepare them where they're going. So maybe not every yoga class is it necessary to get up on that soapbox and start to scream about politics and about social change and about justice, because someone might not be able, their nervous system might not be able to contain it, integrate it, and understand what the hell we're talking about. It's important to let someone titrate. The thing is, I think the issue is more in the teacher. The teacher not wanting to ruffle feathers, wanting their students to come back, they want to be liked. So it becomes more about our own identity. And what I say in the book, there's a line, and I'm going to paraphrase myself because I don't remember exactly what I said, but it's something like, we have to be willing to dismantle the identity that we have as a good person to that of a whole person with faults and graces. And that's what happens. I mean, people go into yoga and they're like, but I'm a good person. It's like, yeah, we get that. And we have to be able to hold space for our faults and our graces, to be whole. But if someone's really a baby at this, we've got to give space just to allow them to get more settled in their nervous system and then plant seeds. And so I think the challenge is really for the teacher. How do we get more skilled in finding ways to communicate this information without coming across as dogmatic or critical or judgmental? How do we do it with compassion and invite the student into a willingness to be in that level of inquiry without shame and without blame? And also give them the skills that if shame, blame, and guilt do arise, how to work with that and not think that that's bad or wrong, but it's actually a part of the purification process that leads to wholeness. And that's where I want more yoga teachers to get confident and to be more committed within themselves to what real social change looks like and why it's essential and connects back to yoga, so that they can help pull their students along without feeling that they're doing something wrong, bad, or flawed. It's one of the reasons why I wrote the book. The whole back half of the book gives a gazillion kind of resources and skills on how to look at ourselves. I don't call anyone out on their racism or their privilege. I call myself out and show how it connects back to yoga. And that real leadership is our willingness to own our own vulnerability and just tell the truth. And so if teachers are doing that, it creates more space for students to do it. And so I kind of straddle both worlds with that. It's like, yes, do it, but do it skillfully And there are ways to do it. And my hope is a teacher can just, if they want to take a risk, read a little paragraph from my book. If a student gets triggered, say, go call Seane. She wrote it. Blame her.
Well, listen, I mean, I have to say that in recent years, there have been moments where I felt like I've lost some hope in humanity. I've been watching this wave of intolerance and judgment and blame and xenophobia wash over the world. I want to say for the last it's not just the last 2 or 3 years. It's been like 5, 6, 7 years. And I felt like it was my responsibility to stay the course of hope and faith, that this was just a dark moment, a dark age in history, to stay connected to, light and love and God and all that I know, which is true in my being, because it is my being, right? But to say that I haven't been discouraged or gotten angry about this just sort of like tsunami of ignorance would be lying. And I there have been moments where I felt disappointed, exasperated, like no one was coming out and saying what needed to be said and doing what needed to be done. And I have to say that your book changed that for me. I think that's what it really symbolized for me. You changed that for me. Your book is exactly what everyone needs to read, to be able to, I think, unpack their stories exactly what you said, in the spirit of curiosity, in the spirit of analysis, in the spirit of delving deeper into the rational mind of study and dissemination, and maybe moving a little bit out of the emotional, mind of fear, or moving into the emotional mind if people are just so logical and reasonable and staying linear, but to unpack their stories so that they can see them uniquely as what they are, which is they're just stories. Yep. Do you know what I mean? I want the skeptical, I want the cynical, I want the conservative and the liberal to read this book and not allow their stories to prevent them from putting it down or giving up on the process. Because what you've written about is, I think, universally the path of healing, individually, collectively, but it is universally so. You have restored my faith in humanity with this book. I don't know, and I'm not saying these things because I love you and because I want you to be on this podcast. I'm saying this because this shit is true. So I want to thank you really from the bottom of my heart. Your book is, as I had, when you and I years ago were discussing traveling together, and I spoke to Marianne. When I spoke to her, I had used this term. My mother uses it all the time. But your book is, as my mother and Marianne would say, beyond the beyond. It is a life changer. It's a life changer. It's a game changer. It's a path changer. And so, listen, for everyone who's read it and maybe doesn't have the means to reach you directly, I want to say thank you for reminding us what we are, what this journey is really all about. And that, we can talk about the most serious, shadowiest aspects of life and still laugh at the same time and still be in the presence of all of it, because it all coexists.
And to your point, like there's that saying that if you're not angry, you're not paying attention. There's so many reasons to be outraged. We should be outraged and we should express that outrage. The problem I have is that most of us are so uncomfortable with our anger because we think it's not spiritual, that we shove that energy down, and then we get fatigued and we get shut down and numb, and that's not sustainable. It's like, be with that anger, be with that outrage, and then get to work, and then participate, confront the parts of ourselves that are like, I forget it, I'm just going to put the covers over my head and not going to do anything. That this is a time that we're really being called to engage in a way that many of us, like myself, I don't have to engage, I can I'm not going to, the resources aren't going to be taken away from me. My relationship's not going to be, challenged in any capacity. But that's my privilege. It's, if I don't speak up and out, who will? And I feel like that's the role that we have. But it's not that I get furious. I just take it into therapy with me. I get discouraged. I just get it on the mat. But I don't try to pretend for 1 second that that's not somehow useful information. I just think to myself, that anger must live in the bodies of so many beings who don't have access to any kind of resources. What must that feel like? And I let myself feel gratitude that I do have the the access to resources, whether it's spiritual resources, financial resources, educational resources. So how dare I not use them? How dare I not go up against my big feelings? And how dare I not act when I can, when my privilege allows me to, when so many can't? Because to do so could actually lead to death. It's not going to lead to death for me. When there's a part in my book where I talk about a beloved yoga teacher who's dead now, who everyone knew was acting out sexually and was being hurtful to students for years and years. But within our community, it's like the mafia, you don't talk out about the family. And I didn't want to either. I was like, I got scared, and I didn't want my teachers and my mentors to be angry with me for speaking out about something that we all know is true. But then I would think about all the young women who over the years have come forward, and they've lost their jobs. They were ostracized by the community. They were publicly called out as liars. And I would read what they wrote and think, they're not lying. I was there. Happened to me. It happened to them. Saw it. And then I would think to myself, how dare I not go in there and tell the truth when I can, when my privilege allows me to, when my authority in the community allows me to, when the platform I has allow me to. It might be uncomfortable, but it's not going to cost me my life or my job, where it might cost someone else theirs. And to me, as a leader in the community, I really sit back and I think this is what we must do, is to recognize how do we take advantage of these privileges in a way that actually benefit everyone? And that's what got me through writing this book, was those moments of feeling hopeless, and that other part of me that was just like, oh, honey, like, you want to know what real hopeless is? Like, look around you. Now, what do you got to do to actually confront this and make a difference? And to me, it was always tell the truth, tell the truth, tell the truth. Show what that looks like, and be brave enough so that someone else doesn't have to take that hit.
Revolution of the Soul is sold on Amazon. It is sold in any bookstore you can get to. In Canada, go to Chapters Indigo. In the States, go to Barnes & Noble. If you want to know more about Seane, about the events that she gives, the festivals, the trainings, the retreats, some of the retreats are exclusive to her mailing list. Go to her website at www.seanecorn, that is SeaneCorn.com/contact, and get yourself registered there. Seane, listen, I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for doing this at the tail end of the tour, which I can only imagine has been just debilitatingly exhaustive. And I love you, and I really appreciate it. And well done. I'm so proud of you. I can't even put it into words, but really thank you for putting this into the world, because it makes the world a better place than when we found it.
Oh, Bram, I love you so much. And I'm so glad that you and I walked this journey together. I know you're such an ally, not just to me personally, but I also know that you represent so much to your community. And I'm proud to be a part of this, because I knew your questions were going to be thoughtful, and that you were going to understand exactly what I was talking about and roll with me and be able to just like dig in really deep. So thank you. I'm very proud, and I'm very grateful to have this platform to express myself.
Well, thank you. It is an honor.
Oh.
All right. Well, listen, you have all been listening to the Examine Life with Bram Levinson. Give it all a good think. I'll see you later. This has been the Examine Life with Bram Levinson.